Hi everyone, in this video we're going to be going over basics of lighting inside Unity. So we're going to be covering the different lighting modes you can use and how we're going to potentially build assets and find some resources that will let us take advantage of some of the lighting features inside Unity. So Unity uses a physically based rendering workflow. In Unity 5 it introduced something called the standard shader, which made this process really easy. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the different lighting modes there are and really how you turn each of them on and off and what they do. Now, it's really hard to sort of understand and appreciate all the stuff that can happen in lighting with Unity in a short video. And, we need to deal with a lot of assets, but we can go over some basics pretty easily. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to just make a quick plane and a cube. Okay, and we're going to bounce some light off of this stuff. Let me go ahead and zero these guys. Okay, and I want to make sure I have materials on each of these, so I'm going to go ahead and make a materials folder. And I will make a cube and a floor material. Okay, so the cube and floor material, let me go ahead and apply these to them. And for now, I'll just go ahead and give the cube a different color, but if I click on these materials in the inspector, I can see all this different stuff that they can do. So in a physically based rendering workflow, that means we have a couple different texture maps and texture channels rather that we can use and assign. So right now these are all unassigned, so nothing's happening. But if you have your 3D model and a texture with all this stuff, you could fill all these out. So things like the metallic channel, if you use different PDR workflows, you might not have metallic, you might have something else, and it's not always the same, but you get the general idea usually. And this allows the lighting and texturing to look and feel more realistic. So the way lighting works in Unity is pretty simple. You can add lights to your scene just like you would in Maya or Blender or whatever you guys use to model and composite scenes before out of a game engine. If you've done any like animation work, it's the same idea inside a game engine for the most part. So we can go ahead and we can place lights. So I can go up to Game Object Light, and I have a bunch of different options available to me. I'm really mainly just concerned with these first four things right now. We'll talk about reflection probes and light probes a little later, but every new scene you make in Unity, if you at least have the 3D option turned on, if your project settings are set to 3D by default, you'll get a camera and a directional light. So the directional light is a directional light, and if I focus on it, you can see it's this sun symbol, and then we have a bunch of rays coming out of it, indicating that the direction the sun is pointing. So I can actually go ahead and move this around, right? And you can see this directional light kind of behaves like our sun. In a sense, it's where light is coming from, and so a directional light's really useful for exterior lighting in particular. In fact, you can see the light box, the skybox rather, the skybox being this thing we see in the distance, right, moves around. It's we can actually even see the sun sort of move around based off of our directional light, and this is all stuff that you can control. Okay, so moving the rotation of the directional light is one thing, but every light has pretty similar properties in the inspector. I can change the color, so if I want to have like a purple scene, I can make my directional light purple. I don't actually want to do that, but that's something I can do. I can change how intense the light is. You can see I can make it so intense that it actually drowns out the red on the cube. I can have some indirect bouncing. We're not really going to see that with so few objects in the scene. I can change the shadow settings, so I can have a light cast no shadows if I want. You can see now the shadow disappears off the cube. Soft shadows you can see sort of fade out on the edge, whereas a hard shadow is really nice and crisp. And for the most part, you're going to want to use soft shadows if you're trying to have realistic lighting, and you can fiddle with all of these sort of settings. You can see the bias is just one option for the shadow, and there's all sorts of things. So I am not a lighting expert, but it's good that if you're using Unity, you understand how to at least look at and understand what's happening with the lighting. So you can even set the strength of shadows, and so lights are shadow casters as well as light emitters, okay? Which is important for later on. So you can also have lights only light specific layers. So like with the camera, you can have only render specific layers. A light doesn't have to cast against every single layer. So if I go ahead and make a new layer, let me go ahead and call this cube layer. Go back to the cube and set it to the cube layer. Now if I go to this directional light and I tick off the cube layer, you can see now the cube's no longer lit by my directional light. It basically, if you imagine that light are a bunch of lines, you know, these rays coming from over there, it just passes through anything that's on a layer that's not checked here. So, but I do want it to light the cube, so I'm going to go ahead and keep that on. So there are a couple different lighting modes inside Unity, and to show them off, I want to add a couple more lights first. So we've already seen directional light. I'm going to go ahead and add a point light. So a point light is just well, it's what it sounds like. It's a light in a point in space. So you can see that I've got this yellow sphere around here, and that's showing just how far the range of the light is. And I'm going to bring that in. So I can click on those handles in the scene view, or I can go into the inspector and mess with it there, right? It's this range parameter. I'm going to go ahead and change this to like green so that we can really see it different. And all right. There we go. Just wanted to turn off the directional light so that we can actually see it. So when you disable the game object with the light, right, it stops emitting light. But now you can actually see the green light is there. It's just kind of faint, right? So I'm going to go ahead, turn the directional light back on. I'm going to lower the intensity of the directional light. I really only want basically shadows from my directional light. I'm going to go ahead and bump up the intensity to like 4 on this light, okay? And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to move this around. I'm going to have a different light on each side of the cube. I'll make this one purple. And let's see, how about you can be blue. And so you can see that these lights of different colors are basically just adding the color onto the surfaces of the geometry the lights touch, right? So that's what light is, at least to a 3D game engine, right? That's like the effect it has. So, you know, depending on which color of the light and how intense it is, we see it cast on these surfaces more clearly. Okay, so let me go ahead, let me make one more light. So even if I duplicate a point light, you can actually change what kind of light any light is by simply changing the type. So I'll change it to a spotlight. You can see now it's like it's a cone because it's a spotlight. I'm going to rotate this down so it's pointed on top of the cube. All right, and you can see that it is pretty much right on top of it. I'm going to change this guy to yellow. Okay, so you can see that the lighting isn't super advanced, right? Like this whole spotlight, even though it's sort of occluded by the cube, it just pops through and things like that. I don't have shadows on all of these lights. If I went ahead and did that, we'd see shadows pretty much everywhere to the point where it wouldn't matter. Turn them off. There we go. Yeah, well, when we turn on shadows for the spotlight, right, now the light is glued because it should be shadow. So I'm going to change this to spotlight just so we know. And basically, okay, so we've got a bunch of different lights set up now. We can talk about some of the different lighting modes there are. Okay, so if I open the lighting tab, I go to Window, Lighting, and then Settings, okay? We get this lighting tab, and I like to have lighting tab, at least when I'm working on lighting, I like to keep that below my inspector. While I'm lighting things, I'm not really using the console too much, so I'll put it in there, but you use the hierarchy certainly a lot while you're lighting. And the lighting tab gives you a couple different, well, not a couple, a lot of different settings that you can change, okay? So there are 3 main lighting modes inside Unity, all right? There's real-time lighting, there is baked lighting, and there is mixed lighting. So if I click on any of these lights in the inspector, you see there's this mode button. There's real-time, mixed, and baked. So if I go ahead and hit play, a real-time light, well, let's go ahead and move the camera in a lot closer. There we go. So a real-time light means I can move the light around at runtime, and the light moves with it. So you can see I'm moving this light, I can control it, and we get moving light. So that's pretty simple to understand. That's real-time lighting. But real-time lighting is really expensive. Let's say you have a really complicated scene, right? Pretty much casting light, and in particular having objects like cast and receive shadows, is pretty much the most expensive thing you can do when you're working with 3D game assets in a game engine, right? It'll cause you the most performance loss. So you can only add so many lights before your scene starts to chug. So what if we want to have this really nice physically based scene with lots of different stuff happening all at once, but we want to also have nice performance? Well, what we can do is we can use baked lighting. All right, so like I said, real-time lighting is if I hit play, I can move these lights around, but not only can I move the lights around, I could move this cube around, okay? And moving the cube around means that, okay, the lights have to recalculate themselves, and the shader and everything has to do its work over and over again at runtime. Now, there is a lighting mode that solves this issue, and that is the baked lighting mode, okay? And so the baked lighting mode is if I just set a light to baked, then I can bake that light. But you'll see that it actually disappeared from the scene here, and there's a very good reason for that, okay? So the problem I just mentioned, if I hit play again, I said if it's a real-time light, I can move the cube and it recalculates it. But what baking's going to do is, the goal of a baked light is to say, okay, we're going to take the information and data from this light and we're going to store it as data that we load instead of trying to calculate it at runtime. Okay, so we just set this green light to say, you know what, we want to calculate this data instead of having it go at runtime. And there's a couple things you need to do to make sure that we actually have a calculate of that data. Setting the mode to baked is only one thing. Like I said, I can move this cube right now and it gets lighting differently at runtime. You have to mark objects in Unity as either static or, well, dynamic objects. And every object by default isn't static. And if you make a static object, then that means it can receive baked lighting. Okay, so if I go up in the inspector on any game object I click, you'll see there's this static flag. If I click this checkbox, what I'm saying is, okay, I am a static object. I'm not going to move. Okay, objects that don't move can receive baked lighting. So, but now if I go ahead and hit play, I shouldn't be able to really move this cube. And yet I could move the cube. That's right. Okay. Apologies. So you actually need to save the scene before you can do baked lighting. So I'll just call this main. And there we go. Okay. So now it went ahead and baked some lighting. All right. Okay. There we go. Now when I hit play, you see now this object's static. I can't move it, right? I marked it as static. I told the game engine that, all right, this is a static object. It's not going anywhere once I hit play. Once that happens, then there's nothing else to do. The object's going to be still. All right, so let's see. Where was that green light? It was over here. Okay, our green light was really, really hard to see. And our plane isn't static either. So I'm going to go ahead and mark that as static. And now I'm going to wait for it to rebake. And there we go. Now I have that green light back. Okay, so baked lights only get emitted on static surfaces, and you need to save the scene before you can actually start the baking process. Okay, and the baking process is by default set to happen automatically. In this lighting tab, okay, at the very bottom, it has this Autogenerate. If I uncheck it, I can actually go ahead, I can clear my baked data, and you can see that light and everything disappears. A new light that you bring in the scene before you run baking, okay, if you have it set to bake, it will give you like the real-time preview just so you're able to gauge. But once I go ahead and bake the light, and I do that by hitting Generate Lighting, now if I move the light, you see the actual green light doesn't move with it. So if I set this to auto-generate, though, every time I move the light, it's going to restart the baking process, and you can see that happening in the bottom right. You get that little progress bar. So with just this one light, the baking doesn't take too long. In fact, this is pretty manageable, and it's not that bad. Now, any game engine that really has a PBR workflow is going to have to deal with this, right? You're going to have to mark some objects as static, and you're going to have to kind of pick and choose what you want to be lit in real time and what you want to have baked. So we've talked about real-time lighting and baked lighting, but there is one more mode that we can use, and we set it on our lights, and instead we can set this light to mixed. Okay, and so a mixed light does two things. It provides baked lighting, but it's also basically duplicated at runtime as another light. So if I go ahead and hit play, I can also move the green light around still, and it sort of gives you the best of both worlds, but we're not really going to see the mixed lighting do anything until we add some of the light probes and stuff later on. So we can go ahead and do this with a bunch of stuff. Let me go ahead and set our spotlight to baked as well. See, it runs through again, and you can see the baked lighting is different. It's not exactly the same as a real-time lighting, and that's because it's baked. It's calculated differently. It's not the same kind of lighting. So when you're making a scene, it's really important that you sort of settle on the lighting mode you want right away. Now, there are all sorts of options here, okay? Let's say I want to disable the real-time mode across the board. I don't want any real-time lights to use global illumination. I can check off real-time global illumination, okay? And when I have real-time global illumination checked off, these real-time lights don't provide any global illumination. What global illumination is doing is it's saying, okay, our lights are going to bounce, and that bounce light will light other objects. And so basically, we would expect our scene to perform better without global illumination on, but it could potentially look a lot worse. We could also even turn off baked lighting. And then this forces every light to real-time mode. Okay, so you still have real-time lights when you have all these stuff disabled, but it's just not global illumination, right? It's not really taking advantage of your physically based workflow. Instead, this is basically turning on the legacy lighting system before Unity 5 came out, which means that there's no GI happening and no like bounce lighting. You're not getting any of the fancy stuff that the system can give you. I'm going to go ahead and turn it back on, and you can actually go ahead and you can look at the light maps that are generated. So a light map, like I said, this is that data that is stored for all of the objects in your scene. So you can kind of see that the lighting for each side of the cube is sort of stored in these maps. And so there's a lot of different stuff that's going on here. Okay. Okay, so that explains the lighting modes really simply, but this is a really like contrived example. In fact, if you go to the Unity documentation, okay, and you look up their lighting techniques, you'll most likely get to this tutorial, and they'll give you a very similar setup, okay? You're like, okay, well, I can light a cube with these various colors, and I mean, that's helpful, but we don't see it in a great setup. So Unity has a couple of sample scenes. Their Viking Village scene is a great thing for you to go in, and you can see how they set this stuff up in a little bit more developed of a scene. But I want to show you guys a couple of free resources that are out there that will give you assets to sort of take advantage of this, okay? So go ahead and save the scene. I'm just going to make a new one, and I want to show you guys some substances. All right, so substances are this new... It's not that new anymore, but it's getting more and more well known by the day, basically. And in fact, I think Substance the other day said something like 80% of AAA developers are using Substance, the Substance tools daily. And so what substances are, okay, I'm going to go ahead and drag in something called Substance Share here. What Substance Share and what Substance at Large is a substance is basically a material that automates this whole physically based workflow for us in terms of getting textures that can really take advantage of it. So when I looked at the standard shader in Unity, if I click back on the cube, right, we have all these maps, right? A substance, what it does is it basically generates all of these for us. And then the substance itself, which is from Algorithmic, if I go to Algorithmic's website, they're the ones who make these tools. There's the two main ones. There's Substance Painter and Substance Designer. Basically, Substance Painter is something that lets you paint textures on 3D models, kind of like you might do in ZBrush. Substance Designer, on the other hand, is something that lets you author your own textures procedurally with a node-based editor. They're really cool tools, and I want to talk about them in the future, but for now, we can just go ahead and use the substances that other people generate. So if you go ahead and make an account on the Substance Share, which is share.algorithmic.com, you can have access to this pretty big library of honestly pretty good materials. And I believe they're all free for commercial use, but especially for learning, this is a great resource, okay? Now, most of these things are actually built for those Substance Designer and Substance Painter tools, but if we click on this Materials tab, we have access to a lot of different substances that we can use inside Unity. So Unity supports substances out of the box. And in fact, in a future version of Unity, you're going to be able to access the official Substance library, which isn't a free service, you have to pay for it, but you'll be able to access it right inside the Unity editor itself. But I'm just going to go ahead and click on one of these materials, okay? So what you want to do is you want to make sure that you only grab the ones that are spherical. Every once in a while, let me see if I can find one. You'll see something like this where it's not a sphere. That means it won't really go into Unity. It's not a material per se. It's something that you're going to use inside Substance Designer or Substance Painter. If you are a student, you can get a year of Substance Designer and Substance Painter for free. I highly recommend doing that and checking them out. All signs are pointing towards these tools becoming an important part of any artist's workflow when it comes to game development, in particular 3D game development. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to download this brick, okay? I'm going to open up this zip file, okay? Now, something that's really annoying about Unity that you may have experienced now that you're using Unity is you can't drag and drop from a zip file right into the project. I get really annoyed by this. You have to go ahead, you right-click an asset, show it in the Explorer to get to where you want to import things, and then you can go ahead and drag it in this way through your File Explorer. So I'm going to make a Substances folder, and I'm going to go ahead and drag in the SBSAR. The SBS file is for use in Substance Painter or Substance Designer. The SBSAR is the archive Substance file that you can actually use in other programs like Unity. So if I go back in here, okay, now my Substances folder has this brick uneven stones inside there, okay? And so this brick uneven stones, it's a special kind of asset. It's a substance asset, okay? And it has an arrow that I can expand, and you can see that what this asset is it's a material, and then it's a couple of different textures, okay? So the material, or the substance rather, is generating all of these, okay? And this material is a standard shader that just has all of these textures plugged in automatically. So if I take this material and drag it into the scene, look at that. I have my substance. And look at this. This substance is an awesome looking texture, and we didn't really have to do anything. It's got everything we want out of a material, okay? So we can change the height map, right? Look at that. I can make those stones look like they're really tall. I can make the normal map go crazy, and I can multiply all these things. Substances themselves are procedurally generated, right? So if you click on this substance, okay, and you scroll down, eventually you're going to see this something called procedural properties, all right? And you can go ahead and some substances will have their own things here. This one doesn't seem to have a lot of different options, but that's okay. I'm going to import some other substances here in a second that do. And you can see that this really changes the textures that are generated by the substance. Okay, so substances are really helpful, and they really kind of help you show off the lighting capabilities in Unity to some extent. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make this plane a lot bigger. All right, so that we can sort of see some of the variations in this texture. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go back to the material. And I want this to tile a lot more. So I'm going to change the tiling property on the material from 1 and 1 to 0.2 and... Oh, not 0.2 and 0.2. I'll change it to like 5 and 5. There we go. Now it repeats a lot more. Okay. And now you can see inside the game camera, we really see... a lot of sort of the detail in this texture. And now substances aren't like a free ticket to having a good looking, good textured scene, right? It still comes down to the artistry of like putting it all together. In fact, just looking at this, right, maybe I turned the height map up a little too much. But you can see like if I turn it down all the way, it doesn't really look like it's bricks anymore. I think they had it at 0.02 as their default. And maybe the normal map I made a little bit too high. Okay, so in fact, I'm gonna make. Nope. I'm going to make these tile a little bit more. Okay, so this is just one substance. All right, and because it has all these maps of our PBR channel installed, right? If I go ahead and move this light, right, you can see those different channels doing their job, right? So for those who aren't familiar with how these different channels work, right, the albedo channel is sort of the base color of the texture, right? The metallic and smoothness is saying kind of how shiny, right, how much light should bounce off of that part of the texture. The normal map is saying, let's sort of imitate depth and texture here, right? The height map is sort of saying, let's make it look like there's actual elevation. Height map and normal map seem pretty similar, but the height map is sort of like a normal map on crack in a way. And then the occlusion map is telling you where light really shouldn't be hitting as much, and so like, you know, this part of the brick right at the base of the brick should probably be occluding light. We shouldn't be collecting too much light there, and instead we want most of the light to happen up on the bricks themselves. So you can kind of see all of these channels reflected as I move the light, right? As I bounce it around, we get this really fancy looking effect. And, you know, if you make a game with a fancy day-night cycle, you'll see this stuff happen all the time. If you're not familiar with this workflow and working with it, just go and look at modern games, and you'll start seeing stuff that looks at least something like a substance pretty much everywhere now. They're becoming really quite common. So substances and lighting are not the whole picture, right? Like, we still need to build assets to take advantage of this whole pipeline. So what I want to do is I want to build a modular wall asset that's going to use a substance, and we could use this to build like a castle wall. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and open Blender and model in UV really quickly just a basic like castle wall. And this isn't going to be the best looking castle wall, but we'll get the idea. So I'm just going to go ahead and Google a castle wall real quick. You should, in theory, always be working from reference, but we all kind of get the idea. I'm going to make something like this that has, oh god, what are they called at the top? Ramparts? I can't remember. Either way, we're just going to build the one basic side of the wall, and we'll UV it and apply a substance to it. Okay? And bring it in Unity and show how we can use modular assets to create larger levels pretty quickly. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make a cube. I'm just going to scale this a little bit, scale it on its y-axis, and so I'm just planning to make one small chunk of the wall. All right, I am going to subdivide this a couple times, So I am not going to show you guys how to model. I'm going to assume you guys either already have that knowledge or can find a tutorial that will show you how to model. Blender is my program of choice. It's just free, but you can certainly use Maya, Max, whatever you're comfortable with. So subdivide. And I'm just subdividing this a couple times so I can extrude the top. Okay, now this is a pretty, like, lazy way to do this. All right. But you know, we'll get the idea from it. I'm just gonna go ahead and select every other part of the wall. All right. And I actually want it to be not symmetrical because I'm going to stack these next to each other, right? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to extrude this along the what? Nope. The z-axis. Let's say like that much. Okay, great. Okay, so we have a pretty dorky looking castle wall, but it sort of gets the job done. I'm going to go back to object mode. I do want to make sure that my shading is set to smooth. It's just going to work a little bit better if I do that. Let's go into edit mode. I'm going to swap over to UV editing. So this is really just a quick and dirty job. This is not how you would want to make an asset. But you know, it will at least get you part of the way there. So I'm going to go ahead and mark some seams because I want to UV this. I want to make sure that oh goodness. Basically, I'm just going to cut out faces of the wall here. Oh my goodness. Every once in a while, Blender just drives me up the wall. Okay, there we go. Go. Start selecting those edge loops. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and mark this seam. Same thing over. Nope. If anybody watching this knows how to do this a little bit better, I just changed up my Blender interface so that it kind of automates to this thing you're seeing here when I swap to the UV editor mode. If anybody knows a faster way to deal with this, make it so that I'm not selecting edges I don't want, I would really appreciate it. But okay, so again, this is not a video about UVing, and really what I'm focusing on doing here is I'm just making it so that I have nice kind of flat surfaces that where I can really kind of see what's happening. So I'm not too concerned about how this unwraps. I'm not concerned about optimizing it at all, but I'm going to go ahead and mark a seam there and there as well. Go ahead and unwrap this. And all right, so we've got our really basic castle wall. Okay, and I'm not following like any good conventions at all here, by the way. I guess I can go ahead and make a new material here, and I'll call it castle wall. So if I now export this object, okay, I'm going to say file, export FBX. I'm going to export this in FBX. I'm going to go into, I'll put it on my desktop for now. I'll call it castle wall FBX. All right, I'm going to go ahead and import this into Unity. Import new assets. Desktop is called castle wall. All right, there we go. All right, I've got a very kind of bleh looking model here. All right, I'm going to go back to Substance Share though, and let's see if I can find. What happens if I search castle? Ooh, castle wall. All right, this doesn't have the greatest rating, but let's check it out. Oh, this is a Substance Painter file. It's probably one of the reasons why it doesn't have the All right, well, not that then. Let's just grab another stone texture. Let's see here. Maybe we can find something with a little moss on it and something that we can drive with those procedural properties, huh? Okay, here we go. Stone bricks. Download this. Nope, didn't mean to open it. Okay, let me go back into Unity. And, whoop. There we go. Control J. I'm just trying to find the asset here and drag it back into Unity. Okay. Let me drag this to my substances folder. There we go. Now we have some stone bricks. I'm going to just go ahead and grab this material and plop it right onto my wall. Okay. So, we have our basic wall with our material applied to it. It doesn't look super good right now. It looks like we need to make this texture tile quite a bit more, so I'm gonna, there we go, that looks a lot better. Okay, I can fiddle with the offset if I want it to make it look like these stones bounce a little bit more. Ordinarily, you would set up all of this inside a tool like Substance Painter or ZBrush, and you wouldn't really do the texturing inside Unity, but you can. You can see the poor UV job didn't give us a great look up top. I could go fix that in Blender just by adding another seam, really. Let's say we add one here. Mark the seam. And there we go. FBX. And I'm going to go ahead and find... I've just got a shortcut to basically write where this is, and I'm going to go ahead right in here and overwrite my castle wall.fbx. There we go. It still doesn't look great, but it'll be fine for now. So, okay, so we've got our substance applied to this. Let's go ahead and see if our stone bricks have any procedural properties. There we go. Okay, so this substance has some procedural properties. We can mess with how many bricks are present in the X and Y. We can talk about how much we get a bevel. You can see this just shows that this texture is procedurally generated, which is really cool. They have it generate how much wear and tear there is, and because it's procedurally generated, you can actually modify these at runtime, which is super cool and useful. So we have like a castle wall, but if we want to make like an actual... If we want to reuse this asset like it's a procedural asset, we need to be able to easily place it, okay, next to each other. So when you're building a level, you can hit Control D to duplicate it, and you can try and move things close to each other. And we can even kind of see, right? This is why I built the asset this way, so that I can place it all next to each other. And I can get a wall as long as I want, just by placing things basically next to each other. So what I could do instead is I can hit... Shift V. Yeah, if I hit Shift V, you can now see that my cursor is actually changing basically the pivot point of the object I'm selecting. It's not actually changing the pivot point, but basically it's saying I'm going to snap from that point to another point. So you see how it went from one to the other? I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to duplicate this castle wall again. I'm going to hit Control D. Then with this snap mode enable, and again, that's Shift V. So Shift V, you see, pops me out of it. Shift V, get back in. And now, if I just hover over a vertice, right, you can see that it snaps to that vert. I'm going to click on the vert from the one I just duplicated, and then click to the vert I want to snap to. And you can see that I am placing these walls pretty quickly, just side by side. And so I get a nice, longer... castle wall pretty quickly. And so I don't know why the UVs are rotated on the back. I didn't really look at the map it generated, but again, this just shows some of like the benefits of like building your assets carefully. And I have not built them extremely carefully here, but you can see some of the items. So I can now move around all of this, and this just makes it really handy to build like a really simple scene really fast. So if you have bunch of other assets, you can do all sorts of stuff. Let's say I just grab another cube, right? I can make like towers at the edge of this wall. And let's scale it on its Y a bunch. So, okay, I could do that, and then I can go ahead and take the same stone bricks material and apply it to the cube. And that doesn't look great, but you know, you can use this to sort of block out your scene too before you go ahead and really texture it. So take all of this stuff, and you can see I get a really basic but incomplete wall that I can use. Then I can go ahead and I can prefab this, all right? So let's say I make another empty game object. Let's say I move this to one of these. So using that pivot snap mode with Shift V again, I move it to one of the verts on the wall. Not the plane, please. There we go. All right. Sort of in the middle-ish. And then I go ahead and make all of these children of this game object. I just call it wall chunk. And I can go ahead and prefab this. And you can see basically out of two assets, I can make really unlimited variations on size and lengths of walls. And now if I have to change the texturing on this little wall chunk, right, every single place it's referenced would get updated. So when you're building a level, right, you can really take advantage of a lot of this stuff, right? So now, look at that. I get that. In fact, what if I wanted to say, okay, this isn't like a walkway, this is like a bridge or something like that. There we go, right? I've got, I've basically got that just by placing these pieces together. And sure, yeah, it doesn't look fantastic. And now that I've made a non-uniform scale on this, right, the material looks a little weird, so I need to adjust the tiling as a result. And I can do that pretty easily. And again, it doesn't look great on this. So you want to make sure that your UVing is on point when you do take advantage of these tools. But now I can go ahead and I can bring in some of these lights, okay? So I've got my directional light. Let's go ahead and put it like that. Let's say we want to try and make this more like a sunset. It's going to be pretty difficult with the skybox we've got, but let's go ahead and make the directional light a little larger. And you can see this is a well-made Sussens, among other things. It looks pretty good when we fiddle with the lighting still. I can go ahead and I can add some more point lights if I wanted. Now, if you're building a scene, right, you want your light sources to make sense, so maybe you would place like some torches along the way, and you don't just have light coming from seemingly nowhere. But we can sort of light the path this way. And so this is like not a great workflow for lighting per se, but it gets you started and at least familiar with the tools. So really what I would suggest in order to really practice this workflow is to go find a scene that you want to duplicate and duplicate it. Start by blocking it out with just cubes and basic gray boxes, and then building assets modularly so that you can really make quick changes to get it to look the way you want. Then once you do that, once you get it blocked out, you can start working on developing the lighting all at once, and it can really come together. And again, if you want this to perform well, you're going to need to balance between your baked modes. All right, if I go ahead and set this to static, you see that if I have a bunch of children, it's going to ask me to change all of them at once, because presumably you'll want, if the parent is static, you want all the children to also be static. And you can see that because I've got a lot more objects that are a little bit more complex, the baking takes a little bit longer. And it has to go through a couple of different stages, and it will just be continuously doing this. And what's nice is that you can still do other stuff while it bakes, so I can just go ahead and change everything to static real quick. But sometimes you don't want it to always auto-generate. So sometimes I'll uncheck this. If I know I'm going to make a lot of lighting changes at once, I'll uncheck it so that in each interim step it doesn't change them all at once. But I've made all the changes I want to make here, so I'm going to go ahead and leave them be. So let's see, where's the camera? While the lighting bakes, I'll move the camera into a more useful spot. And there we go. So, okay. So just with basically, well, I don't know, like 2 minutes of modeling, maybe. I guess we'll have to check the recording. And a couple minutes inside Unity, you know, this is definitely not a great looking bridge, but you can start to see like how you would piece together higher production qualities and some of these fancier tool sets. So this is a really just brushing the surface of a really complicated and in-depth topic. But you know, like in a future video, we'll cover, I mentioned them before, but we'll cover things like reflection probes and light probes. And these are things that will let you optimize your lighting, let you have the benefits of both baked and real-time lighting at the same time, basically. You know, if you really want to get into asset creation, there are a lot of really great resources out there that show you how to do that. I am not an environment artist. My just really quick work in Blender there, you know, made something that might pass for like a beginner's project, but you know, if you want to get really into it, you can make some pretty nice things. And this workflow is pretty standard across game engines. You're going to find something really similar inside Unreal. You're going to find something really similar inside CryEngine. Anything that promotes this PDR workflow, you're going to see similar ideas and concepts. I will say Unity might be a little bit further behind in that regard. It sort of is a late comer to that game, right? I'd say Unreal and CryEngine really like push that forward, so their tools are really mature for this. But you can at least learn it in a setting like Unity. So there are a couple more settings inside lighting that I want to talk about just to cap off here, okay? So there's the real-time global illumination and mixed lighting that we talked about, where you can turn off whether or not you actually have baked lights and real-time lights. Everything in the scene right now is baked, and we can actually verify that by going to our Light Explorer, okay? And our Light Explorer is another editor window that we have that shows all the lights inside the scene in one, basically just filters and gives us a nice little interface. We can change their type, we can change what mode they are, all from a really easy to use interface, change how much shadows, and this is a really, really helpful place. So if you also have a static material or object that is static with an emissive material, right, that's basically a light source, right? It's emitting light. That's why it's an emissive source. You'll see it pop up there. And when we look at reflection probes and light probes, you'd also see them in here. Okay, so I'm not actually sure why it's taken so long right now, but this is not a complicated scene. I have got a pretty good computer. But light mapping can take a long time. I know some animators who've said, like, oh yes, game development, I don't have to wait for frames to render. Well, if you want to make a nicely lit environment, you're going to have to wait for your lighting to render. Well, to bake, really. And if you've got a lot of indirect lighting, it could take a long time. There's a lot of stuff you can change to make it faster. So these light mapping settings you can lower. You can change the size of the light map if you want. It has some parameters like you can set. So, you know, if you just want something really quick, I'd suggest lowering the settings, and then when you build for production, go ahead and turn them on for real. Okay, so it just finished. And you can see that lighting is all baked in, and now if I go ahead and move around these lights, nothing happens, but it tries to turn the bake on again. So if you've got a big scene, I suggest turning off Autogenerate and only generating the lighting when you want to yourself, okay? So there is something called the Progressive Light Mapper, okay? inside Light Mapper, if I go from Enlighten to Progressive, and now I'm going to turn on Generate Lighting. Oh, got to save the scene. We'll call it Bridge. And now the Progressive Light Mapper is a little different than Enlighten. So Enlighten is the old system, and Unity 5.6 brought the Progressive Light Mapper. And what the Progressive Light Mapper does is it focuses on what you have in your scene view. All right, so it'll focus on lighting thing that's in the scene view, and then move on to everything else. So if you had Enlighten on, you would have to wait for the whole thing to finish before you see your preview update. So if you're making lots of little tweaks, and you want to see them in real time, you definitely want to have the Progressive Light Mapper on, and you'll want to have it let's see, where'd the option go? I cannot find the option anymore. There's a way to turn it off so that it doesn't even prioritize your view. Oh, there it is. How do I miss that? It's right underneath it. I could turn that off, but you want to keep it on. It's basically the best benefit of the Progressive Light Mapper. You do get different results with the Progressive Light Mapper versus Enlighten. It is a different lighting engine. The results are meant to be similar, but the Progressive Light Mapper still says it's in preview. But pretty much, make sure I would make sure you're in mode, and you can lower the samples to make it go a lot faster. So if I halved it, it should run significantly more smoothly. But everything you change is going to cause the lighting to rebake, and you can see that, oh god, we've got all this time that we have to wait for it to bake, and let's just not do that. So I'm going to go ahead and end the video here, but what we got was a really basic overview of lighting and substances and sort of modular assets. This is not a great resource for you to go ahead and go out and build your own fully featured, nice 3D environment. This is just to get you familiar with some of these tools and ideas. So if you think, if you have any suggestions rather for how I can make this more helpful or useful, please go ahead and leave a comment. Feel free to subscribe, and share. I want to try and get stuff like this to be a little bit more easy for people to digest. I watch a lot of videos on this, and people either jump right into the deep end, where they won't even show you any of the cool stuff, and I'm trying to balance a little bit of both of that here. So, let me know what you think in the comments below, and thanks for watching.